master's research. She worked with me in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems on a really great project looking at sustainability in the blueberry industry, which we learned a lot about the changes in BC agriculture over a period of time to where blueberries were kind of a niche specialty crop to where they became a dominant use of the landscape in this region. After that, she took an internship with the BC Ministry of Agriculture, worked on climate adaptation. So got a kind of a glimpse into the policy landscape for what resources do farmers have available to them as they continue to face both the economic constraints that they're facing in their production systems, but also increasingly changes due to climate change. She then came to IRES to do a PhD jointly supervised by myself and Naveen Ramankutty. So I think Susanna really embodies the kind of student that thrives in IRES, somebody who has an ecological background in the natural sciences, who's gotten social science training, who engages with policy, engages with community, and kind of tries to pull all of that together into a truly kind of transdisciplinary dissertation project on kind of what do we think about organic agriculture. And she'll tell you quite a lot more about that in the talk. So I won't go deeply into her dissertation topic. I'll let Susanna do that. But I do want to just highlight a couple of things that she did during her PhD. So Susanna was on the board of directors of Food Secure Canada, which is a national organization that convenes all kinds of different actors in the food system across Canada, from government to farmers unions to Indigenous food sovereignty organizations to anti-racist food policy organizations, and tries to kind of convene conversations about food policy in Canada from that kind of multi-sectoral and intersectional perspective. And that was during a period of pretty intense institutional change. So I think Susanna was took a real leadership role in thinking about how to take that organization into a space more conducive to the practice of social justice and food systems. I really want to honor the work that she did in that and her PhD. And without further ado, I will also congratulate her for her upcoming postdoc. She was awarded a very prestigious SSHRC 2-year postdoctoral fellowship to work with Dr. Annalise Weiler at the University of Victoria on just transitions for farm workers in the face of climate change. And that really is a natural extension of some of the work that she'll talk about today that came out of her dissertation. So thank you, Susanna, and I look forward to hearing your talk, and also Taya. Thank you.
Is that going to work? Can everyone hear me? Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that kind introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure to share my work with this wonderful community that I've enjoyed very much being part of for the last 5 years. And I'm really excited to hear from Taya next. So my talk is titled Just in Principle, Assessing the Contributions of Organic Certification to Fairness for Farm Workers in Canada. Agriculture is at the center of society's most pressing sustainability challenges, including food insecurity, climate change, and various manifestations of social inequity. Organic agriculture has been proposed as a remedy to many of these challenges by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, improving environmental problems such as biodiversity loss, and providing better conditions for farm workers. However, there are important knowledge gaps about how organic farmers around the world are currently enacting the international organic principles of health, ecology, fairness, and care versus following jurisdictional standards and the practices that they govern, which have been shown to be more narrowly oriented towards limiting chemical inputs in agriculture. My PhD research looked broadly at how organic farming contributes to socio-ecological sustainability in Canadian agriculture and examined both ecological and social aspects of production. And my presentation today is focusing on a subset of this research that looks at how organic certification contributes to fairness for farm workers in Canada. Of the 4 organic principles, that of fairness has increasingly been the subject of much discussion and debate. Agricultural work is notoriously unfair, especially the conditions experienced by migrant farm workers. there's a lack of systematic studies of the social dimensions of organic farming, resulting in a large degree of uncertainty around social sustainability outcomes. Publicly available data suggests that organic farms employ seasonal migrant workers at similar rates to other farms in Canada. And despite the ideological commitment to fairness, evidence shows that being organic doesn't guarantee better conditions for farm workers, as unpaid internships, the mistreatment of migrants, low wages, and musculoskeletal injuries are all inequities that persist on organic farms. Labor inequities are thus a major gap in scholarship about organic agriculture and a priority for improving agricultural sustainability in practice. These gaps are even larger when looking specifically at the Canadian context. Despite Canada's significance in the global organic sector, it has been excluded from previous assessments of organic standards, and much of the existing research has been focused on agronomic practices in field crops in the prairie provinces. While there have been some studies that examine sociopolitical dimensions, they still leave a lot of important gaps in our understanding of organic agriculture in Canada. Like many in this room, I took an interdisciplinary approach to my PhD as a whole, which was informed by the fields of geography, sociology, and food system science, among others. Each chapter used a unique combination of data and methods. In chapter 2, I assessed the organic standards in 3 North American countries and drew from a combination of policy and legal documents and qualitative interviews. In chapter 3, I analyzed quantitative farm management data from the Canadian Agricultural Census. In chapter 4, I performed a statistical analysis of farm management practices from a survey that I conducted with vegetable farmers in BC. And in chapter 5, I used a participatory action research approach that drew from participant observation, qualitative interviews, and document analysis. So as a starting point for understanding labor and social aspects of organic agriculture, we wanted to know what the organic standards in North America say about social aspects of production. The first part of our analysis was assessing the strength of principles for a sustainable organic agriculture expressed in the organic standards. The results are shown in this heat map here, with the highest scoring principles, those with the strongest expression in the organic standards, at the top. We found a relatively similar pattern of importance between countries, especially for the principles that scored the highest and the lowest. And with Canada and Mexico scored the highest overall, and the US had the weakest expression of most of the principles. But in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to these 4, as we saw a clear pattern of all 3 countries placing very little to no emphasis on social principles in their organic standards, with social fairness and social development scoring the 2nd and 3rd lowest of all principles evaluated. We also coded and scored a total of 127 benchmark management practices that we identified from the literature and scored them between 0 and 3. We organized the practices across 3 practice domains that you see in the panels on the figure. Canada and Mexico had the strongest practice requirements overall, with Canada scoring higher in terms of animal management and Mexico scoring higher for crop and land management, whereas the US scored the lowest in both of these domains. Importantly, all 3 countries scored 0 on all practices related to social and employment standards that we evaluated. While this is in line with the relatively weak expression of principles related to social aspects of organic farming, this discrepancy between overarching movement principles and required practices is stark. For the 3rd component of our analysis, we evaluated governance and legal context of the standards in each of the countries and found that Canada's governance of organic standards is uniquely democratic. All 3 countries have a multi-stakeholder standards governance body, but in Canada, it is this committee that actually makes the decisions about what happens to the organic standards, in contrast to the US and Mexico, where it is the government office that makes the decisions and is only required to consult with the standards governance body. Drawing from my 3rd dissertation chapter, which analyzed nationally representative data from the Canadian Agricultural Census, we wanted to know how organic farms compared to non-organic farms in terms of labor. Individual farm level data or micro level data is not publicly available in Canada. but we were able to access aggregated or group data from the agricultural census. So we focused on comparing certified organic farms to all other farms in Canada, and our main independent variable was certification status. In addition to the data being grouped into organic and non-organic farms, we also had the data grouped by 3 control variables: industry type, farm size, and region. We examined 4 areas of management in this chapter, but I'm going to focus on the 2 variables related to labor, which were labor demands or quantity, and the seasonality of labor, which is an aspect of job quality. So on the screen here, I have 4 different plots, all looking at different measures of labor demands or labor intensity, grouped by organic status, with the green being organic farms and the red being non-organic farms. And this is all farms in Canada. And you can see that the organic certified farms consistently show higher labor demands by all these measures. However, when we looked at patterns in labor-related variables by the control variables as well, there was much more variation. This is a plot of the amount paid in wages per acre, one of the measures of labor demands that we used, showing that the industry category of greenhouses is a huge outlier with just disproportionately higher labor demands. Results were also more divergent when we looked at the other measures of labor demands by control variables, as well as the seasonal distribution of labor. So in the table, you can see on the left, the labor variables we looked at, and in the second column, the measures we used. And while we found that these values were consistently higher in aggregate when all farms were aggregated together, so more intensive labor demands per acre or per farm on organic farms, and more seasonal labor on organic farms, these patterns were more divergent and weren't as consistent when we looked at them by the other control variables. So because of the complex interplay between the variables as well as the imprecise nature of the categories, it was really difficult to make conclusions about what is actually driving these patterns in labor. So after gleaning what we could from the national census data, we wanted to look more closely at labor on organic farms in a single industry and region. So we examined job quality using a survey of BC organic vegetable farms. Our survey targeted primary operators of vegetable farms in BC, and we ended up with a sample of 91 organic vegetable farms. Our total survey was actually a sample of 135, but as not all farms hire workers, our sample for the job quality questions that I'm sharing right now was only just a subset of the larger sample. So by job quality, we mean that characteristics that make a good job. Here we drew from sociological literature and evaluated some of the measures on the screen. And we developed 2 question sets that asked employers about job quality in 2 different ways. We looked at practices and we looked at attitudes about employment or job quality. And when comparing the 2 groups in terms of job quality, we found no significant difference in job quality practices. But when we looked at job quality attitudes, we did find that uncertified organic farms actually had higher scores for attitudes related to job quality. To look at what drives this variation, we ran a few regression models with these inputs on the screen as independent variables. And we ran, one for each practices and approaches. And for practices, we found that the only 2 significant predictors of job quality were farm size in terms of economic size and farm income. So larger farms economically and farms that had higher income were more likely to have better job quality. And this is only amongst organic farms. And for job quality attitudes, we found that motivations for social justice was the only significant predictor of job quality attitudes, and both models were statistically significant. So my last chapter that I'll just briefly touch on is published in Canadian Food Studies, and it's called Sharing the Struggle for Fairness, Exploring the Possibilities for Solidarity and Just Labor in Organic Agriculture. This participatory action research emerged as part of a collaboration with 2 BC-based food movement organizations, Fueras Emigrante, a migrant worker collective, and Organic BC, an organic association. Drawing from theory for transformational social change and food justice, the central question we explored here was how do the organic communities' efforts to enact fairness compare with demands from the migrant justice movement? So the central proposals that we found and that we illuminated through this research To enact fairness by the organic community, we're adding labor requirements to national standards, so addressing that gap with that we mentioned previously in practices in the organic standards, expanding the definition of the principle of fairness to more explicitly describe and provide the basis for action towards labor improvements, integrating voluntary labor questions into regional certification processes, supporting employer education so that employers know more about how they can better support their workers, and centering the experiences and voices of migrant workers in their discussions and gatherings. But when we analyze these efforts alongside organizational materials from migrant justice groups and perspectives contributed by my co-author, Fuerza Migrante, we found that these central efforts by the organic community to integrate fairness into organic certification do not align with the main demands by migrant justice groups, whose central demand is the structural reform of all migrant worker programs affecting agriculture in Canada, not just the organic sector, and especially for permanent residency status for all on arrival. So the findings from this chapter really helped illuminate what is needed for a generative alliance between these groups. This included a need for the organic community to more explicitly confront the role of colonialism, capitalism, and racism in producing unfairness in the food system in the first place, better representation of workers, not only in discussions, but also decision-making about the sector, and more tangible action in solidarity with migrants. And finally, for the organic community to fully advance fairness, they might do better to ask, how can we advance migrant justice demands, and broadly speaking, instead of just thinking about what they can do within their own sector. So to conclude, we found little evidence overall that organic certification is more fair in practice. In particular, we showed that organic standards in North America have no social requirements and weak reference to social principles. Our results from both the census and survey analysis show that the lack of guaranteed social standards seem to correlate with what we find on farms, where it was difficult to attribute patterns in labor quantity and quality of jobs to organic certification itself. Investigating how detailed crop type, farm size, and region interact with requirements and values imbued in organic to produce distinct labor patterns is an important area for future research. Our survey results also suggest that motivations matter more than certification for predicting job quality attitudes on organic farms, but that for job quality in action, it was really economic factors, costs, income, and size seem to matter the most. At the same time, the efforts by some members of the organic community to integrate fairness do show promise, especially the nascent efforts in solidarity with migrant justice movements, and the uniquely democratic governance of Canadian organic standards mean that these actors actually could have a pathway to make these changes in practice. So just to finally conclude, I'd like to thank my amazing supervisors, Hannah and Naveen, my fantastic committee member, Claire, my collaborators and co-authors, Fuerza Migrante, Erica Luna Perez, and Laura Castrejon Violante, and Noah Bridson, and my two research groups, and the initiatives and agencies that funded my work. And that's it. So now we take questions. And I will try to repeat the question. And I saw your hand at the back first.
Yeah, so thanks, great talk, super interesting. I was interested, you said in Canada that Canada is pretty democratic, and you said that the reason they're democratic is because essentially the groups who are actually doing the organic farming are those setting the standards. So does that lead to a potential for regulatory capture, or like the standards to just, is it like how are they allocated? Is there something that are just, big agri business takes over organic farm, takes it over, or is there some sort of like defense against that? Or
yeah, so that's exactly what. So I didn't get a chance to go into too much depth on that aspect. Oh, sorry. Yes, repeat question. So the gentleman at the back was asking about how the standards governance is more democratic, essentially. So yeah, in Canada, the main difference is that it's this committee of 35 members that are elected to represent larger groups in the organic sector in Canada. So some of them are producer representatives, some of them are a general interest category, some of them are a user category, and they are selected to represent those groups. And so they're meant to consult with them. in terms of changes that are made. And the main process that they oversee is the standards are revised every 5 years. And so there's an open public comment period, and they have to go through and resolve all those comments. And they operate on a consensus decision-making model that is stewarded by the Canada General Standards Board, CGSB. So there's a government agency that convenes and supports them, but there are no members of government that have a vote in those processes. And the committee is relatively larger for the size of organic sector compared to the US and Mexico. The organic sector in those countries is much larger, many more producers, just many more people involved. And the committees are 15 people, and they just sort of make recommendations, and the government officials decide what they want to do. And another part of this paper that we went quite in depth on is the research that shows that governments are very invested in certain kinds of development of organics because it's a strategy to increase exports and increase GDP. So that's sort of stops with or helps avoid government interference. And as far as any one producer or corporation, there might be a producer representative that is part of or leads a corporation, but that's only one vote of 35, and everyone has to agree to make a given change. So it's not perfect, but and actually I'm involved with some research following up on this as a case study model for food systems governance because it seems to be so unique. I saw a hand here. Yeah, so they were asking about whether I think there's a reason why the social side is so weak in the organic standards, and whether it's because it's more consumer driven or maybe just more environmentally driven. And I think you answered your own question. I think, or economically driven, you said. I do think that it's interesting that when you look at the history of the organic movement, it includes a lot of social values, but those are not as easy, I think, to capitalize on in terms of making money. And the standards definitely do respond to what consumers want to see. And so there's been a real shift in focus as the organic sector has grown towards environmental aspects and on the environmental aspects that relate to what the product is like at the end. So, whether the product contains residues of pesticides or, the idea of purity is also, it's something that is sort of like nascent in a few of my chapters, but I think is really interesting in the ways that it shows up and drives a lot of the organic movement. So unfortunately, actual action that extends to workers has not really been seen, but I think those are some of the reasons why. Oh, and we're out of time. Thank you so much for the great questions and for listening, everyone.